That's what Judy told 911. On April 17, 2003, she called police in a panic, saying her husband, John Parker, had just been outside their car in the parking lot of J&J Parker Industries in Merrillville. She said she heard the She said she saw a figure dressed in black running from the scene. She said it all happened in seconds. When officers arrived, they found John Parker outside the vehicle. The scene looked sudden, targeted. But something about it didn't sit right. This wasn't a random street corner. This wasn't a late-night robbery. This was outside his own business, in broad daylight. And the only witness was his wife. At first, her story seemed clear, an unknown attacker, dressed in black, fleeing into the distance. But as detectives began asking questions, small cracks began to form. Why here? Why him? And why did certain details not match what investigators were seeing on the ground? Because sometimes the most important evidence isn't what someone says, it's what they can't explain. This is the story of John Parker, the shooting that looked like an ambush, and the investigation that uncovered something far more calculated. John Parker was not the kind of man you would expect to become the center of a nationally televised murder case. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't controversial, he wasn't the type who sought headlines. He was a businessman, a provider, a man who believed that if you worked hard enough, long enough, you could build something that lasted. John was born into a Midwestern environment that valued discipline, routine, and responsibility. Before John Parker ever had his name on a company sign, before there were offices, payroll, or industry contracts, he was just another young salesman carrying product brochures and knocking on strangers' doors. And that matters, because the sales world he entered wasn't forgiving. It didn't reward effort with sympathy. It rewarded results. If you didn't close deals, you didn't get paid. There was no safety net, no guaranteed salary, just commission. He started in direct vacuum sales, specifically high-end Kirby systems. These weren't cheap household appliances. They were expensive, multifunction machines, marketed as long-term investments. Selling one required more than enthusiasm. It required stamina. A typical day began early. Sales meetings, performance tracking, managers pushing numbers, then hours on the road, driving through neighborhoods, identifying homes, knocking on doors. And most doors didn't open. Those that did closed quickly. Rejection was constant. But in sales, rejection isn't emotional, it's mathematical. You keep going because eventually someone says yes. John learned to detach from the no. He focused on the next opportunity. He refined his pitch constantly. He didn't repeat the same script robotically. He adjusted. If someone seemed skeptical, he leaned into product quality. If they were budget conscious, he focused on durability and long-term value. If they were proud homeowners, he framed it as protection for their investment. He became observant. He studied posture, tone, micro-reactions. He paid attention to hesitation before someone said no. He understood that objections weren't refusals, they were openings to persuade, and persuasion became his strength. He would demonstrate the machine inside customers' homes, vacuuming carpets, lifting dirt from deep fibers, showing them what they didn't know was there. He turned the demonstration into proof, not a sales pitch, evidence. That's how you close. But the job didn't end with a sale. There were follow-ups, installments, training new reps, tracking territories, managing quotas. Sales wasn't glamorous, it was repetitive discipline. Drive, knock, smile, pitch, adjust, close, repeat. Over time, John didn't just survive in that environment, he excelled in it. He climbed performance rankings, he earned higher commissions, he built a reputation as someone reliable, someone who didn't miss targets. In sales culture, top producers aren't just respected, they're studied. Others watch how they speak, how they structure conversations, how they handle resistance. John developed what seasoned salespeople call controlled confidence. Not loud, not flashy, but firm, measured, convincing without desperation. He learned another critical skill, tracking numbers. He knew how many doors he needed to knock to get a demonstration, how many demonstrations led to a sale, how many sales hit monthly goals. He treated selling like a system, not luck. That mindset would later define his business philosophy. Sales also taught him resilience under pressure. You could spend 8 hours on your feet and walk away empty-handed. You could have a strong week followed by a terrible one. Income fluctuated. Stability depended on performance. Living like that builds either fear or focus. John chose focus. Eventually, he moved beyond just being an individual seller. He mentored newer reps, taught them how to structure conversations, how to handle objections without defensiveness, how to close with calm authority. Training others forced him to articulate what he had internalized, strategy. And strategy is where employees become entrepreneurs. The sales world showed him something important. If you controlled the structure, you controlled the outcome. If you owned the operation instead of just participating in it, the ceiling was higher. That realization planted the seed for ownership. The long hours, the commission pressure, the door-to-door grind, they weren't just paying his bills, they were shaping his mindset. He learned consistency beats emotion, preparation beats improvisation, systems beat luck. By the time he transitioned into building something larger, John Parker wasn't guessing. He understood revenue cycles. He understood motivation. He understood how to push for performance without appearing reckless. He understood negotiation because he had done it thousands of times. Most importantly, he understood value because he had sold it. Every dollar he made in those early years was earned through conversation, persuasion, and endurance. That builds attachment. It builds ownership mentality. It builds someone who doesn't take risk lightly. And that's important, because when someone spends years building wealth one commission at a time, they don't view it casually. They protect it. They manage it. They control it. Years of door-to-door selling didn't just shape John Parker's income, it shaped the structure of his future, including the woman who would eventually stand beside him. Judy grew up in Indiana, raised in a working-class environment where stability mattered and reputation meant something. She wasn't drawn to chaos or risk. Those who knew her described her as composed, practical, and socially aware. Someone who understood how to present herself well and navigate professional spaces with confidence. She built her early career in administrative and business support roles, working in environments that required organization, structure, and attention to detail. She understood paperwork, systems, scheduling, professional communication. She wasn't impulsive. She was calculated in her own way. John met Judy during the years when he was still deep in the sales grind. Long days, commission pressure, constant movement. Their connection developed during a period when John was ambitious but not yet established. He wasn't a business owner. He was a man trying to climb. And Judy saw that climb happening in real time. She saw the early mornings, the late-night planning, the rejection that came with door-to-door sales, the days when commission checks were uncertain, and instead of seeing instability, she saw potential. Their relationship grew alongside his rising performance. As John's success in sales improved, so did their shared stability. Commission checks grew larger, incentives followed. The financial unpredictability that once defined his life began to level out. And with that stability came something new: vision. John no longer wanted to just sell for someone else. He wanted ownership. And those conversations didn't happen in isolation. They happened at home, across kitchen tables, in late-night discussions, in practical breakdowns of risk versus reward. Judy's background in structured office environments meant she understood operational realities: payroll, documentation, administrative flow. She wasn't simply listening to John's ambition, she could evaluate it. When John began seriously planning J&J Parker Industries, Judy knew what that meant. Leaving structured commission sales to launch a company wasn't just ambition, it was exposure, overhead, liability, responsibility for employees, cash flow gaps, risk that could ripple directly into their personal finances. But they stepped into it together. In the early days of J&J Parker Industries, the pressure intensified. Office space had to be secured, sales teams recruited, training systems built from scratch, marketing materials produced. Revenue had to not only come in, it had to exceed operating costs. There were weeks when the business felt fragile, and during those weeks, Judy wasn't disconnected from the strain. She lived in it. Budget conversations became sharper. Expansion plans were weighed carefully. Every financial decision carried consequence. But gradually, the structure John envisioned began to work. The same discipline that made him a top salesman, tracking numbers, refining systems, pushing performance, translated into leadership. J&J Parker Industries stabilized, then it grew. Merrillville became the company's operational base. Contracts expanded, revenue strengthened, and with growth came visible success. A stronger financial foundation, a higher standard of living, a reputation that carried weight locally. John wasn't just a salesman anymore. He was a business owner with employees depending on him. But something shifts when ambition becomes identity. J&J Parker Industries wasn't just a company to John, it was proof. Proof that the years of rejection and relentless knocking had meant something. Proof that risk had paid off. And when a man builds something with that level of effort, control becomes important. Very important. As the company expanded, financial planning discussions became more sophisticated. Insurance policies, asset protection, structured financial safeguards, the kind of conversations that happen when a business owner begins thinking long-term about security, legacy, and protection. Those decisions touched both of them, because when business and marriage intertwine, boundaries blur. From the outside, they appeared stable, established, successful, a couple who had climbed together from commission uncertainty into ownership and financial growth. But success adds pressure, the kind that doesn't show up in photographs. And by early 2003, the life they had built, carefully, deliberately, was sitting on a foundation no one outside their inner circle fully understood. Not yet. From the outside, their life looked secure. A growing company, a recognizable name in Merrillville, financial comfort, stability that had been earned the hard way. But growth changes dynamics. In the early years, John had been the grinder, the one chasing commission checks, knocking on doors, pushing through rejection. Now he was the owner, the decision maker, the one responsible for payroll, contracts, expansion. The business demanded more of his time than ever before. Longer hours, more stress, more control. And when one partner becomes consumed by building something, the other begins to feel the shift. J&J Parker Industries wasn't just John's job anymore. It was his identity. Every conversation circled back to it. Revenue, staffing, sales projections, risk management. Even at home, business wasn't far away. Calls interrupted dinners. Paperwork followed him into evenings. Planning replaced relaxation. That kind of intensity can slowly create distance. Not explosive arguments, just space. Financially, they were in a stronger position than ever, but success brings new conversations. Insurance policies were updated, coverage amounts increased, asset protection strategies were discussed. When a business owner rises, so does the value placed on security. And security comes with numbers. Policies worth significant sums, structured beneficiaries, long-term financial safeguards. Those decisions are normal in business, practical, responsible. But they also introduce a new reality. If something happens, someone benefits. Around this time, those close to them would later describe subtle changes. Nothing dramatic, no public scenes, but tension doesn't need volume to exist. It can live in silence, in clipped conversations, in separate routines. John remained focused on expansion, on protecting what he built, on keeping the company stable in a competitive environment. But pressure builds in layers. Running a business requires trust in employees, in partners, in the people closest to you. And when finances, insurance, and ownership intertwine inside a marriage, the lines between personal and professional become fragile. There were discussions about control, about money, about future planning. Not fights that neighbors could hear, but conversations that carried weight. And sometimes when two people build something together, the question quietly shifts from "how do we grow this?" to "who controls it?" By early 2003, J&J Parker Industries was operating steadily. The business had momentum. John had momentum. But inside that stability, something was tightening. Not loud, not obvious, just pressure. And pressure, when ignored long enough, doesn't disappear. It waits. April 17th, 2003. It didn't begin as a dramatic day. There was no storm, no public argument, no visible sign that anything was about to fracture. It was an ordinary morning at J&J Parker Industries in Merrillville. The kind of morning that blends into every other business day. Phones would ring, employees would clock in, paperwork would move across desks, sales numbers would be discussed, contracts reviewed. It was routine, structured, controlled, just the way John liked it. He had built this place from scratch. Every wall inside that building represented years of work, years of rejection turned into resilience, commission turned into ownership, ownership turned into authority. By April of 2003, he wasn't knocking on doors anymore. He was running the operation. And that morning, nothing publicly suggested it would be his last. As the day moved forward, conversations happened like they always did. Business talk, logistics, planning, the rhythm of a company in motion. Outside, the parking lot sat quiet, ordinary. Employees moving in and out, cars parked in familiar spaces, nothing unusual to draw attention. As evening approached, the building began to empty. The energy shifted from busy to still. Offices dimmed, conversations ended, doors closed one by one. Then, at some point, John stepped outside toward the car. There are moments in life when everything feels routine, when your mind is still on work, on numbers, on tomorrow's plans. And then there are moments when something interrupts that routine forever. Too sharp, sudden, breaking the quiet of the lot. According to the 911 call that would follow, Judy said she heard them, 2 distinct shots. She told authorities she saw a figure dressed in black run from the scene. An unidentified person, a shadow, a quick escape. When police arrived, John Parker was lying outside his vehicle. the business he built standing behind him, the parking lot now a crime scene. What looked at first like a random ambush, a targeted attack, a man gunned down outside his own company. But almost immediately, questions began forming. Because random attacks don't always happen in controlled business lots, and unknown figures in black don't always leave behind nothing. April 17th didn't end with just a shooting. It marked the beginning of something much darker, because as investigators would soon discover, this was not chaos. This was planning. And the story that unfolded next would unravel everything that appeared stable on the surface.
In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, Judy's version of events seemed straightforward. 2 gunshots, a man dressed in black, running away from the parking lot, a sudden, violent ambush. But investigators don't stop at straightforward. They test it. The first questions were simple. Where exactly was the shooter standing? How far away? What direction did he run? Judy described a figure dressed in black, dark clothing, moving quickly. But when pressed for detail, height, build, facial features, there wasn't much more to give. No clear physical description, no distinguishing characteristics, just black clothing. That alone wasn't proof of anything, but it was thin. Then detectives looked at the scene itself. The parking lot wasn't large. It wasn't a chaotic public space. It was directly outside John's own business. Limited entry points, limited exits. If someone had been waiting there, they likely would have been visible to passing traffic or nearby businesses. So investigators began asking, why here? Targeted shootings typically have a motive. Robbery? There were no signs of struggle over property, no indication that valuables were taken, nothing missing that would suggest a random attack. Then there was timing. The shooting happened at a very specific moment when John and Judy were together near the vehicle. Not earlier in the day, not randomly while he was alone in the building. It happened when she was present. That detail began to stand out. As detectives re-interviewed Judy, they noticed subtle shifts in phrasing, small changes in how events were described, the order of movements, where she was standing, how quickly the shots were fired. Nothing dramatic, just slight adjustments. Investigators also examined physical evidence, shell casings, trajectory, distance, the placement of John's body in relation to the car. And when they began reconstructing the angles, something felt off. If a shooter had run up, fired, and fled, there should have been clearer directional evidence. Witnesses in nearby areas should have seen someone leaving in a hurry, a car speeding off, a figure crossing the street. But canvassing the area produced little. No solid sightings, no independent confirmation of a man in black. And then there was the emotional response. Everyone reacts differently in trauma, investigators know that, but they also watch for consistency. They compare initial statements to follow-up interviews. The more they asked Judy to walk through those minutes again, the more the edges blurred, not in obvious lies, but in uncertainty. And uncertainty, in a case like this, draws attention. Because when a crime scene is controlled, when the location is specific, when the only clear witness is the spouse, and when no one else seems to have seen the fleeing suspect, detectives begin to widen the circle. Not outward, inward. As detectives moved beyond the parking lot and into paperwork, the case began to change. Because crime scenes tell one story, money tells another. One of the first things investigators quietly requested were financial records, not because they had proof of anything yet, but because motive often hides in numbers. And what they found immediately raised eyebrows. John Parker carried a substantial life insurance policy, not unusual for a business owner, but significant. High 6 figures, structured carefully, updated in recent years. The primary beneficiary, Judy. Again, on paper, that is normal.
Spouses are beneficiaries all the time, but timing matters. And investigators began mapping timelines, when policies were increased, when financial discussions occurred, when tension may have begun building inside the marriage. Then they looked at debt. Business growth requires loans, expansion requires credit, and while J&J Parker Industries appeared stable, running a company always comes with financial pressure behind the scenes. Were there cash flow issues, outstanding obligations, private financial strain? Detectives started pulling bank records, credit activity, recent transfers. Nothing explosive at first glance, but enough movement to justify deeper review. And then came the phones. Phone records are honest. They don't panic. They don't misremember. They log. When investigators subpoenaed phone logs from the weeks leading up to April 17th, they weren't just looking for random numbers. They were looking for patterns. Frequent contact, unusual timing, calls late at night, communication spikes. And there it was, a number that appeared repeatedly in Judy's records. Not business-related, not easily explained, a connection that predated the shooting. When detectives dug into that number, they uncovered a relationship that hadn't been emphasized early in interviews. A man, someone with a background that raised immediate concern. As investigators deepened the inquiry, they discovered that communication between Judy and this individual had intensified leading up to the shooting. Not casual, not occasional, frequent, and then abruptly reduced after April 17th. That pattern alone wasn't proof, but it was direction. When investigators interviewed this man, his version of events didn't align cleanly either. Timelines were vague, movements weren't clearly supported, and when pressed, cracks formed, slowly. Investigators began piecing together something more deliberate. Financial motive, increased communication, a staged narrative involving a man in black, and a shooting that occurred at a precise moment, outside a business with limited witnesses, limited surveillance angles, and controlled access. Then the breakthrough came. Further forensic review and witness interviews connected that phone number to an individual who had both motive and opportunity to act on someone else's behalf. The possibility of a murder for hire was no longer abstract. It was forming structure. Detectives now believed they weren't looking for a random gunman. They were looking for a hired one. The theory became clear. Someone close to John had allegedly orchestrated his death, using another person to carry it out. The focus narrowed sharply. Investigators reconstructed movements on April 17th. Who was where? Who had access? Who knew the routine? Who knew John would be in that parking lot at that time? And one realization became impossible to ignore. The shooting happened in a way that required familiarity. Familiarity with John's schedule, familiarity with the business location, familiarity with timing. The random man in black began to feel less like an intruder and more like an operator, acting on instruction. By the time arrest warrants were drafted, investigators believed they had uncovered not just a shooter, but a conspiracy.
When detectives brought him in for formal questioning, the tone shifted from routine to strategic. They already had the call logs. They already had location data. They already had witness statements placing him in the area. What they needed now was pressure. At first, he denied everything, said he wasn't there, said he had nothing to do with John Parker. But inconsistencies surfaced quickly. His timeline didn't hold, movements couldn't be confirmed, and as investigators confronted him with the communication history, the walls began to close in. Eventually, the prosecution's theory crystallized. This was not a random shooting. This was a murder for hire. Authorities alleged that Judy Parker had orchestrated her husband's killing and recruited the gunman to carry it out. The motive, prosecutors argued, was financial, life insurance money, and control of assets tied to J&J Parker Industries. Arrest warrants were issued. When Judy was taken into custody, it marked a dramatic turn in a case that had started with her as the grieving spouse on a 911 call.
Cameras captured the moment she was led away, calm, composed, not the frantic witness from April 17. The hired gun was arrested as well. The charges were severe: murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and related counts tied to the planning of the crime. Pre-trial proceedings stretched on as both sides prepared their arguments. Prosecutors built their case around three pillars: financial motive, phone records, and the structure of the alleged conspiracy. They emphasized the life insurance policy, the communication trail, and the calculated nature of the shooting. The defense pushed back. They argued that the state's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, that phone calls alone did not prove intent, that the narrative of a mastermind spouse was built on interpretation, not direct proof. But the prosecution had something powerful: cooperation. As the case progressed, the alleged hired gun reached an agreement with prosecutors. In exchange for testimony, he provided details about the planning, conversations, expectations, payment. That testimony would become central. When the trial began, the courtroom atmosphere was heavy. Jurors listened as prosecutors laid out the timeline from marriage to murder. They replayed the 911 call. They walked through financial records. They showed the call logs connecting Judy to the gunman in the days leading up to April 17. Then they introduced testimony describing the arrangement, how the shooting was allegedly planned, how John would be outside the business, how the scene was meant to look like an ambush. The defense cross-examined aggressively, challenging credibility and motives for cooperation. They questioned whether the hired gun was shifting blame to reduce his own punishment, but the narrative was clear: a husband shot outside his own company, a life insurance policy worth a significant sum, repeated communication before the killing, and testimony outlining a plan. After deliberation, the jury reached its decision: guilty. Judy Parker was convicted for her role in orchestrating the murder of her husband. The hired gun was also convicted for carrying out the shooting. At sentencing, the judge addressed the calculated nature of the crime. This was not a crime of passion, not a spontaneous act. It was deliberate, planned, designed to look random. Judy Parker was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, effectively decades behind bars. The man who pulled the trigger faced his own substantial sentence.
John Parker built his life from the ground up, from door-to-door sales to owning his own company. But on April 17, 2003, everything he built ended in a parking lot outside his own business. What looked like a random ambush turned into a calculated betrayal. This case is a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous threats aren't strangers. They're the ones closest to you. If you want more detailed true crime stories like this, subscribe to Union X Crime. I'll see you in the next case.